I do want to come back to that first question around the date, around January of 2016. My understanding is that Zenith Optimedia has been one of the media groups that has kept their powder dry in terms of demanding viewability as an aspect of trading in 2015, but that you're doing an awful lot of testing.
Yes.
And so if any agency group is going to be ready to turn it on as a common currency, it's going to be Zenith Optimedia. Is that going to be January of 2016?
I don't know if it's January 2016, but you're right in the concept of, listening to everybody speak, you realize how complex the situation is. By the way, it's always the guy with the Z that goes last, and then everybody says all the smart shit, and I'm left with stuff I have to make up. But I genuinely think that we are going to be more prepared than most, because we are taking this year to kind of look through and scrub through the data, right? Whether or not it's going to be 1-1, I don't know. I'd love to say yes, but I'm not sure that's the case, because we still haven't solved a lot of the fundamental issues that have been brought up, right? We still don't have a set standard to get to that viewability metric, right? We're still working towards that. We still have natural discrepancies that are happening. So there's a lot of issues in between that are beyond our control as advertisers, outside of kind of going, here's my number, sorry, you got to use it, which I'm not necessarily adverse to doing. And I think to some extent, I think that has to happen to a degree in order for the industry to move forward. So one side, typically the buy side, because at least that's the side I'm on, is going to go and say, this is the number I'm going to use. This is the vendor I've picked, and I'm going to try to scale that at volume, and then at least get to a point where everybody knows that what I'm working with, I'm using X vendor to track this, or let's say one for display, one for video, because it could be different. But I'm using this vendor to track a specific action, and this is the one you have to work off of. So now, at least this preparation, and part of this year is not simply just testing and looking, but part of it is the preparation. How do we get our publisher partners, because it's partners, it's not just, just not vendors, right? It's partners. How do we get them prepared for what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, and what the good of our clients, what we're trying to do for them, right? So a lot of this is, a lot of test and learn right now, and whether or not 1-1 is realistic, I'd like to think it is. I'd hedge my bet on that, though.
And so with a lot of the work that you've done with partners, are you seeing a set of principles, best practices emerge for the viewable user experience? Yes. Are some of them coming to you to say, well, here's what we've done, Julian, to optimize viewability around our quote-unquote more premium units? I'm going to bring this back, Jonathan, to you and to James from the publisher side. This is about the user experience in the end, and it's not just about getting 1 second and 50% of the pixels. What are some of the best practices that you've seen for?
Well, I mean, the first thing, we are in concert with our vendors and having these discussions. I think the first simple principle is just be honest, right? Be honest about the tool set you're using, be honest about your expectations, and be honest about understanding what that means to the potential business transaction, right? If we are at a point where we don't have the currency fully set, and I ask for something unrealistic, like 100%, because technically, right, we still have issues of that being feasible, then of course I'm going to get a premium return or a premium request back on my price. Am I willing to accept that? Am I not? So a lot of this is just a matter of making sure that you have conversations with your partners and ensuring that there's a two-way dialogue. The other is share the information that you have, right? So if I'm gathering intel and I'm going to Google or I'm going to Yahoo or I'm going to whomever, it's really important that I share the information that I've gathered as much as I'm looking for them to gather the information they have and share it with me. It has to be a two-way street. So I can share because fundamentally, we're probably looking at two different vendors who are doing it. So how do we work in concert? How do I share the information that I have? How do I give you access to that information? And how do I force my technology partners, and I think this is a big thing that not enough people do, how do I force my technology partners to work in concert with my publisher partners, right? So if there's a massive gap between the partner I'm using and the inventory source, don't I need to have to make that connection? Don't I have to get on the phone with those guys? Don't I have to understand the fundamental issues between them to get to that? I think a lot of what's missing here is you either have a one-way street which is not effective, or you don't have proper communications, or you don't have people who are just honest about what they're trying to achieve. So if you could follow those simple principles, I think you can do business in the right way.
Let me just build on that, because I think that we had an example which was like the measurability concept. And we had a placement that with one vendor, they were saying that they couldn't measure the placement at all. And you need to get then a conversation between the marketer, the vendor, and the publisher all at the same time, because otherwise it can lead to a lot of frustration when we're going back and forth with the vendor, like, why can't you measure this placement? They're then reporting out to the marketer that they're getting essentially no viewability. And so these things can quickly escalate unless you're transparent and having the right conversations at the right time.
Yeah.
I'd like to add that I think that from the vendor and the publisher side, that there needs to be more investment and training that you need to provide your sales team and your ops team in looking at the data. There, oftentimes we'll have campaigns that run that they're not even looking at the viewability data unless we flag it. And that is very frustrating, because what we're trying to do is work with you to make sure that our ads are viewable. That's our expectation. So we need the community to ensure that their teams are trained to look at this and look at the information that's being collected, and then optimize or figure out ways to improve that viewability without having us flag it and say, what's going on? Why am I seeing 30% viewability when I was assuming that it was about 50 to 70%?
Yeah. I mean, here's a simple miss. If I'm picking a vendor, I should know what that vendor's capabilities and limitations are, right? I should know how I got to that vendor. What is the process I undertook to go through the 15 or 20 or whatever that number is between all of these partners? How did I go through and pick that vendor? How do I understand what they're capable of, what they're not capable of, where they're projecting, where they're not projecting, and so on, so that when that conversation comes up where a placement isn't measurable, I have an action ready, whether that's in terms, right, on an IO, or whether that's an accepted agreement between agency and publisher as to how you're going to bill that, if you're using it as a measure, or even if you're just using it as directional, right, then great. Then how do we have a conversation about giving me data on that environment so I could plug it into how I'm overall evaluating everything? So it really is, and it's ironic because we're talking about programmatic, which is thinking about the robotic world in the future. But the reality is it's a human business. It requires relationships. It requires human interaction, regardless of the number of systems that we're using. And the key to any of this is making sure that we have conversation in a two-way flow and understanding of ultimately all the technologies that we're using.
Very interesting, Julian. So in a potentially, when this becomes a quote-unquote common currency, in let's say January of next year, we're still going to have implementation issues, but your approach, and one that I think is a great one that you're suggesting, is understand the limitations, have a set of rules, if you will.
Yep.
If this screw up, then apply this.
That's right.
To add efficiency to the market.
Yeah, I mean, I'll equate this to something very, very simple. About 3 years ago, everybody bought video on impression-based, right? Then we switched to GRPs versus a ComScore or Nielsen or whatever tool you're using. And there was massive disruption in the market. And nobody knew how to measure it. Nobody understood. There were gaps between two systems and all this other stuff. We worked through that, and in a matter of a couple of years, that's much less frictional at this point. We're kind of in that same place. But again, it requires the information sharing, it requires the communication flow, and it requires an understanding. When I was going through this process, I made it my business to understand the methodologies of the systems. And then I made it my business to educate my entire organization, the organization I was with at the time, regardless, of what it means, how does this work, and what are the things you need to know when having these discussions, so that when we negotiate terms and conditions or rights of business, we have that all thought out and put into paper, so that there's no issue back and forth, and there's no friction that can come because I have it down on a piece of paper with everybody's signature on it.